Well, welcome everyone. I have noon Eastern time, so we'll go ahead and get started. We have definitely a great and full lineup today during today's webinar. So I'm Sean Doheny. I'm the Vice President of the Informs Military and Security Society, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Like I said, we have a great lineup where we'll hear from Dr. Greg Parnell, recipient of the 2020 Steinhardt Prize, and Josh Margolis, the recipient of the 2020 Bonder Scholarship. Before we get started, I'd like to encourage everyone to connect with us on these handles. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, please let us know. And if you have suggestions for future webinars, let us know that too. We'd love to connect with you. We'd love to hear from you. This session is being recorded today, and we'll post the recording on our YouTube page so that you can go back to it if you miss something, and you can share it with others if you find it helpful. For our Informs and Mass members, we'll post these slides on our Informs Connect page after the webinar as well. And I'd like to introduce the president of our society, Dr. Brian Lundy, who can introduce our first give us an overview of the society and the prize, and introduce our first speaker. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Sean. Welcome to everyone. The first thing I want to do is just welcome those who are already Military and Security Society members, and those who are not, who are Informs members and have joined this or joined this by another extension. Welcome to our community. We hope you can stay longer. We have future webinars in the making, and we have events at Informs conferences as well. So our newsletter will be coming out in March. We look forward to sharing that through Informs Connect. You see here what our mission statement is. I'd like to truncate my introduction so we can listen to and learn from the couple speakers we have today a little bit more. There are a number of benefits for joining MAS, but I just want to thank Sean Doheny for putting together this webinar. I want to thank a couple folks, Nate Bastian, who chaired a committee to select the recipient for 2020 for the Seth Bonder Scholarship for Applied Operations Research for Military and Security Applications, as well as Dr. Dick Deckrow, who chaired the Steinhardt Prize Committee. So for those of you who did not get to know Seth Bonder, and I did not, I got to know him secondhand through a lot of good colleagues. He was not just a senior analyst in the military community, but he was a mentor. And part of this scholarship that we're going to listen to today, this scholarship he bestowed upon his passing to recognize excellence and promote excellence for developing professionals in the military and security applications area. So today we're going to hear from Josh Margolis, who is a PhD candidate, if we could go to the next slide, PhD candidate at Clemson University. Josh is currently finishing up his dissertation and doing the job search. Wherever he lands, I can tell you they will win for his expertise. His expertise lies in the area of optimization in terms of large-scale optimization, combinatorial optimization, and integer programming, particularly towards developing effective and efficient solution methodologies to solve those classes of problems. In addition to being the 2020 Bonder Scholarship recipient for Informs, Josh is also a Gilbreth Memorial Fellowship recipient for our sister society, IISC. Without further ado, I'd like to move into what we're here for, which is to share and to learn from each other. So Josh is going to talk about his research thread that he's developing, and we'll look to continue. So I'd like to hand it over. Thank you, Josh, and congratulations on the award.
Thank you. Should I share my screen?
Yes, please.
Great. Everybody see this okay?
We can. Perfect.
So thanks for the introduction. Again, my name is Josh Margolis. I'm a PhD candidate at Clemson University in the Department of Industrial Engineering. My dissertation topic deals with models and algorithms for vehicle routing and surveillance. And today I'm going to focus on a specific research project that we've undertaken. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about where our thread is going as well. So just kind of an overview, I deal specifically with network optimization, optimization under uncertainty, and then in the defense related application realm, specifically dealing with military and security operations. Uh, our research focuses more on target surveillance, which as we all know is a fundamental military action for surveilling land to get information about how to deploy assets or how to recover assets, things of that kind. In the overarching theme of surveillance missions, we really want them to be reliable. We want them to be high quality. You need to consider a lot of the complexities of the given missions, and you want to be adaptable and flexible as mission priorities can change, enemy capabilities, as the information state kind of advances. You want to make sure that you can make those changes. And also possibly adapting for physical conditions and things of that kind. And today, what I really want to focus on is more of the kind of simple idea of what if we just analyze a deterministic setting before we go ahead and build upon that for the adaptability realm. So just an overview of what the problem would look like that we're dealing with. You can imagine routing a series of unmanned vehicles through a region. When you route unmanned vehicles, they have predetermined GPS markers for which to travel to within a fixed area or a given area of interest. And so these GPS markers or waypoints, we're going to denote in orange here and call those the set B. And these are the reachable nodes in our network in which our vehicles are actually able to travel between and to. The idea is that they want to go within proximity to the secondary or unreachable set of targets colored in green here and denoted by the set W. And so these are the areas that we want to surveil, gather information to, and we're able to do that by either traveling within proximity to them inside their respective coverage areas, or idling at a point within those coverage areas as well. And so we can imagine a feasible solution may look like something like this, where in this example, we're going to route two distinct vehicles, 1 and 2. And for example, vehicle 1 will take this path in blue here. It'll travel from its insertion depot to its extraction depot, stopping along the way at these two distinct waypoints here to gain coverage. And so how do you gather information from the given system where it's twofold? I can either travel between two waypoints and gather information through traveling within proximity, or I can do so by idling nearby. And so I can gain coverage again by those two methods. And so again, what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to generate high quality route plans for target surveillance, but we also want to make sure we're somehow accounting for the specific vehicle characteristics, whether that be the battery life or capacity, a payload, speed limitations, things of that kind. We need to make sure we handle those constraints with our capabilities of what these vehicles can handle. And again, we're routing these vehicles through the series of GPS markers or these waypoints to observe or surveil our secondary set of targets of interest. Now, again, those targets are unreachable, so our vehicles aren't actually traveling to the targets. They're just trying to travel nearby and gather information from them. Just to overview again how coverage is obtained within our network under our assumptions. If I'm traveling between two waypoints here, I and J, and my goal is to observe this target W, W is situated with its own coverage area. So by traveling within that coverage area, it's when I'm able to actively gather intelligence or information. And so how much information or the quality information that I can accrue here is dependent upon two things. One is, what is that length of that intersection within that coverage area? And so you can see as this kind of chord here gets closer and closer to the target, I'll have more area within that coverage area. I'll be able to gather more information. The further it goes, the less distance actually intersects. And so that may be a limiting factor in terms of how much coverage can accrue. The other thing is not only how much distance I have, but obviously the amount of time I'm spending within that coverage area. And so if I'm traveling kind of slowly across this arc, I'm able to get better image quality, gather more information. It's not a zip of the flash, so to speak. And so time is really a factor as well. And so we can see speed optimization coming into play in terms of how effective our routes are going to be as well. And so we can gain coverage in two methods: by traveling between two waypoints or idling at a waypoint that's within the coverage area. And so in this picture, there is no way to idle to coverage of W. And coverage is dependent upon the length of time you're spending inside a coverage area, and time is also dependent upon how the speed you're going and also the amount of distance that's being intersected there. In order to model things, we all know that all models are wrong, but some are useful, and we're trying to make this as useful as possible. And so we're going to make a set of simplifying assumptions to best represent this. First, we're going to deal with a homogeneous fleet of vehicles. So we're going to assume they all have the same image capabilities, speeds, things of that kind. We're going to say that we can observe multiple targets at once, and so they're non-competitive. This assumption stands from maybe the vehicles have a wide angle lens or they have multiple cameras situated on them. Another thing is that the coverage is going to be non-continuous and it's going to be additive. And so you can imagine watching a Netflix series, you can either binge all the episodes at once, and then once you're done, you've finished it, or you can break up the series into chunks as well and watch it periodically. But by the end of it, no matter which methodology you choose, you're going to have watched the entire series itself. Now, this assumption is specific to our problem in other situations, but you can have other vehicle capabilities when you're dealing with a binarization approach, and the image quality or the amount of information you're gathering cannot be, has to be continuous in order to count it as a singular image capture. This is used for things like when you're trying to detect false positives and things of that kind, but I'm not going to get into that for right now. Again, we've talked about idling. We're going to ensure that the targets have a hard constraint for their coverage level. And so I'm going to not only try to maximize how much coverage I can accrue over the given system, but I also want to ensure that each target itself supersedes its threshold level. And I talked again about the vehicle capabilities having some kind of characteristics. You can also imagine characteristics in the system as well. And so we're going to model the energy supply or battery life, or perhaps the GPS window, GPS markers themselves have a security sweep time limitation factor to them, so like time windows on it. And we can approximate that loosely with an overarching operational deadline T. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there with the problem setup and description. Are there any questions at the moment? I don't see or hear anything. So
Yep, sorry about that. Had to find the mute. No questions in chat yet, but feel free to drop them in either the Q&A or the chat as we go through.
Great. So I don't want to get to too much detail on how we formulate this problem, but it's a mixed integer program that looks as follows. And I do want to talk about it in just a high level here. So this first chunk of constraints are our objective function and our linking constraint, and these deal with coverage. So our objective function here is to maximize the coverage of the fleet. Coverage dependent upon two terms. The first one is the coverage accrued by traveling between two waypoints. This is the amount of the proportion of time across an arc that you spend within a coverage area multiplied by the amount of time you're actually spending on it, right? So that's your travel time. So TIJK here is our decision variable. That's representing part of our speed optimization approach that's inherently tied to this problem. Our second term for coverage here is how much coverage or information is gathered by idling at a waypoint within a coverage area. And that decision variable is denoted as Y. And so we're going to try to maximize the total coverage. And we're bounding that by low by a given predefined parameter for each target. And so we see the term repeat itself because coverage is defining the same, but now we're summing over the entire vehicle fleet K for each specific target. And so this is our linking constraint that makes the problem somewhat challenging in terms of separations and things of that kind. We have our standard vehicle routing problem constraints, such as flow balance, node visitation limits, things of that kind, where whether or not we're choosing to take an arc inside a given path is denoted by our binary variable xij. And then we have our set of scheduling constraints. So making sure that if an arc is going to be traveled, you're following its speed limitations, you're going to obey the operational deadline, and we're keeping track again of when I arrive at each node along the path, or it's given schedule by the decision variable S. So how do we go ahead and solve this? Well, there's three ways that we can do this. One is using the mixed integer program itself with Cplex. Another one is to take advantage of some of the innate combinatorial structures that we can see in our given problem, and we can formulate a branch and price framework to solve this exactly. And of course, when we're dealing with operational purposes here, we want to make sure that our methodology is both efficient, but also takes into account the time limiting factors as well. And so we come up with a constructive and improvement heuristic that's going to basically build routes based on unmet demand or scoring techniques that are in the literature from, say, Golden et al. In 2012 and other vehicle routing problems in 2014, 2019, to name a few. We also go ahead and use our improvement heuristic as our initial feasible solution or initial column, if you will, in our branch and price framework. So for those that are unfamiliar, branch and price is essentially a branch and bound algorithm where at each node relaxation, we're going to solve a column generation, which is essentially an iterative algorithm. And so what we'll do is we'll seed the restricted master problem with a subset of variables or columns. in the main problem itself, when we're dealing with columns or variables, there's an exponential number of them. And so the problem is really big. And so we're going to seed it with an initial solution to generate our set of dual multipliers to seed the pricing problem. We're going to solve the pricing problem to see if a column or variable is attractive to include in the restricted master problem by looking at its reduced costs. If the one exists, we'll add it to the restricted master problem and the process will repeat. If none is attractive to enter the restricted master problem, we'll finish processing the current node and we'll move on with the branch and bound tree. And so I talked a little bit about my mixed integer program where we're dealing with routing vehicles through a given network, but we're also dealing with speed optimization. And that's really key, is that's one of our challenges and our problem is that we're looking at route selection and speed setting and we're optimizing them jointly. And that makes things rather difficult. But one of the interesting things is that, well, in terms of a feasible path, we can combine those scheduling constraints and those route constraints and put them together into a new decision variable. And we're going to call that Z. And so what we're dealing with essentially is this new subset of route speed combinations. And so you can imagine routing yourself from, say, Philadelphia to Atlanta using Google Maps, and you'll come up with various options. And those will include different routes like I-81 or 95 or what have you. And then, of course, you can overlay the speed aspect of those routes on top of it. And so if you were to use Google Maps, say it gives you 3 routes and 3 times. And so that'll be 3 route speed combinations. And then for each route, you can also play around with its speed profile and how fast you're going to go along at each intersection or highway. And so you can see that we can represent feasible paths jointly as a route speed combination itself. And again, what are these? These are elementary paths that obey the operational deadline and our arc traversal speed limits. And so a lot of the constraints when we go ahead and do this kind of fade away because now we're dealing with feasible paths already by assumption in this set pcal. And one thing I want to point out is that what we're dealing with is a finite number of these combinatorial structures, and I'll show why that's the case in just a little bit. And so essentially what we're doing is like what you would in a linear program where you have a set of extreme points that can represent the space, and you can take convex combinations of those extreme points to enumerate all feasible solutions. And so this decision variable Z is essentially our convex multiplier that's going to allow us to go between these extreme points and enumerate the feasible region if need be. I'll stop there. Are there any questions on the reformulation from arc-based to path-based and how we're setting up the branch and price framework? Great, I'll keep going. And so what does this motivate? Well, once we solve the restricted master problem, we're dealing with our route speed combinations. And so we're going to use the dual multipliers associated with these Z variables to go ahead and formulate our pricing problem. Now, the pricing problem, again, is a sense of a route speed profile, so it's unconstrained in that regard. And essentially all we're doing is trying to maximize a coverage route, right? We want to find the maximal coverage route. Now, the thing to note here is we're looking at feasible routes that obey both the arc flow balance constraints and those VRP constraints, and also the scheduling constraints, but we've removed that linking constraint. And that's really nice that we can do that because once you get rid of a minimum threshold on a specific target, you get a nice optimality structure that we can exploit. In fact, one of them is that if you're going to idle at a waypoint along the route, we can show that you actually idle at no more than 1 waypoint. Why is that the case? Well, again, in the pricing problem, we've removed that constraint for the minimum threshold of a target. And so this could be a feasible solution. And so we'll notice that this example here for these 2 specific targets, if I were to accrue coverage, the only way I can accrue coverage is actually by idling at one of these waypoints along their circumference of those coverage areas. I don't travel anywhere within the coverage areas, and so I can't traverse an arc to gain coverage. And so I don't have a minimum threshold for any target, and so I don't have to idle at all if not needed be. And so if I have extra resource like time to play around with, well, what am I going to do? Well, I'll look at the target as higher priority or more benefit or a higher weight, and I'm going to go ahead and allocate my resource there. And so we can make this a solution kind of framework here where if I'm going to idle, I'll idle at no more than 1 waypoint. Let's call it V bar. And so I'm going to go ahead and fix V bar. I'm going to then enumerate or try to find the maximal coverage path through that given V bar. And then, of course, I'm going to explore different options of V bar and try to find the best path through them. And keep in mind, we have to keep track of the case where we're not idling at any waypoint as well. And so keeping track of this new structure of idling at V bar and our new route speed profile reformulations, we can actually now explicitly redefine the pricing problem as follows, where again, we're dealing with feasible routes that are following our speed profile and stopping at this path V bar. And if you just look at a high level of what this formulation looks like, well, it's a continuous knapsack problem. I'm trying to maximize a given a function subject to a knapsack constraint where my chosen variables are between an upper and lower bound. And so what do we know about a continuous knapsack problem? Well, the optimality structure will be that if I can rank and sort the ranked ratios from greatest to smallest, I'm going to take everything that's of value at its upper bound until I can't fit anything in my knapsack anymore and take a fractional value of that given item. And then I'll take everything else at its lower bound. And so we're going to go ahead and utilize that optimality framework for our solution methodology as well. And so to solve the pricing problem, we develop a labeling algorithm where we're going to represent a partial path with a given label L. We're going to store its set of waypoints, and we're going to compute its adjusted coverage. So if I'm going to make an extension of that partial path from a given waypoint I to J, I want to know what's the objective benefit of doing that, right? How much coverage do I get from doing that? And of course, this is all in the assumption that we fixed V bar in these scenarios. If I add up the adjusted coverage for the entire partial path, I'll get what's called the cumulative adjusted coverage, and I'm going to keep track of that as well. And so what are we going to do to solve the pricing problem? Well, we're going to perform a partial enumeration of these labels using a dynamic program. But the thing I want to make a point of when we deal with these extensions for these labels, remember we've had this knapsack constraint, this operational deadline on it. If the operational deadline is non-binding, then any extension to a partial path is feasible, and we don't really need to worry about this. However, I'm going to talk about the case where it may be binding, and so we have to check feasibility for the given extensions as well before we go ahead and do that, but I'm not going to talk about that at the moment today. So the thing about the continuous knapsack problem, which is really nice, is you know all the items that are going to go into your knapsack a priori, and so you know, so to speak, where that fractional value is going to take. However, in our dynamic program, when we're dealing with partial paths, I don't know the path at the moment, right? So it's not finished. I don't know where I'm going to apply this token, if you will, that'll allow me to take an arc at somewhere between its upper or lower bound with respect to time. So I need to keep track of that. And that makes this algorithm a little bit more difficult, is I don't know the path and I don't know where to apply that token. And so how do we go ahead and use that optimality structure to formulate our methodology? Well, if the objective weight or the adjusted coverage of adding an arc ij to the partial path is negative, then clearly it's not attractive, and I'm going to try to get off that arc as fast as possible, or I'm going to use my minimum time across that. If it is beneficial to travel at a maximum time, right, so the objective weight is positive, I want to go as slowly across that arc, because the slower I go, the more benefit I get. But it may not be feasible to do that because I'm dealing with maybe a tight operational deadline. And so it may be the case that I'll have to extend that arc or that partial path, excuse me, at both a minimum or maximum time. And we're going to refer to these as the trade-off arcs. And these are the ones that we're going to keep track of during the algorithm. So just to kind of do an overview of what I mean by this, well, if we have some partial path here, L, and I'm going to consider an extension for that partial path from I to J, I can compute its ratio, right, this coverage to time benefit of extending that. And I'm going to take a look at what's already stored in the trade-off arcs here, right? This is using the continuous knapsack framework, where, again, if it's beneficial to travel its maximum speed, I want to make sure, how do I actually make that extension? Well, it may be the case that the objective, the ratio weight, excuse me, is already better than something I've already taken at its, and I'll go back to highlight that. If the ratio is better than something I've already taken at its upper bound, then it would trivially follow that I also want to take it at its upper bound, send it at its maximum time. If its ratio is less than something I've already taken at its minimum time, right, its lower bound, then I'm going to set it to its lower bound or its minimum time. And that's essentially what we're doing here. The issue comes with what happens if it's somewhere in the middle. You can't make that determination. You don't have a reference point there, and you're going to have to make an extension for both cases. And we'll see the labels start to duplicate and the state space start to expand. But we don't want to expand too much. We want to be smart about how we're using our dynamic program. And so this motivates our set of innovative dominance rules. And so if I give you a partial path L, I know its travel times across it and its trajectory. And so I can represent its coverage and time as just a point on this grid. And the idea is that, well, again, I have this token that I know I can use. How does that affect the coverage or the time of a partial path? Well, if I apply a token to a trade-off arc that was given its minimum time, and I want to use that token on it, what does that allow it to do? Well, it allows it to go from its minimum time up to its maximum time. And so I'm going slower and slower across that arc. And so the time for that partial path is actually going to start to increase because now I've increased the time for a given arc. And as I increase the time, the coverage will also start to increase. And we can see a piecewise linear function that looks like this for the range of a given token. And you can do the flip side as well. If you apply a token on a trade-off arc that was at its maximum time going to its minimum time, you'll see kind of a change in the opposite direction. And so you can represent the label in terms of coverage and time as follows. And so we want to make a declaration about how can I eliminate a label from my dynamic program. And so we can talk about dominance specifically. I'm only going to highlight 2 specific cases because the other 2 follow. The first one is in the upper left-hand corner here. I want to make the declaration that L1 dominates L2, right? So L1 visits a subset of waypoints that L2 does. They all end at the same waypoint. But in order to make a dominance declaration, I need to worry about both time and coverage, right? I want to dominate, I want to be better in terms of coverage and faster in terms of time. So if I have this label L1 over here and this label L2, if I apply a token to L2, it'll give me some range of values such as this. But notice that L1 dominates L2 no matter how I use the token on L2, right? It's clearly better in terms of both time and coverage at both extremes. And so I can make the confirmation that L1 will dominate L2. I can make that claim over here as well in terms of time, that L1 will dominate L2 no matter how I use the token on L2 with regards to time. But there exists a solution where I apply a token to L2 in which it can do better than L1 in terms of coverage. But if I can make a claim that applying a token to L1 allows me to do better in terms of coverage in some regard, then I can say L1 will dominate L2. Case 3 is the flip of case 2, where instead of dealing with coverage as our point of concern, we're dealing with time. And case 4 is the concatenation of both case 2 and 3. So I'll stop there. Are there any questions?
None in chat so far.
So I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and skip the idea of the heuristic, but it's a constructive and improvement heuristic that we go ahead and we build routes as such. Just the main idea of what we're doing here is we separate the idea of jointly optimizing speed and route selection. So we'll fix the speed settings, find routes, and then kind of iteratively do that. And so this will give us an initial solution to our branch and price framework. We go ahead and test our instances on 2 sides of, test our experiments on 2 sides of instances. One's our 1-to-1 ratio in terms of GPS markers to waypoints, and the other are a 1-to-3 ratio as well with a 2-hour time limit. Just to emphasize, we're going to compare our heuristic to the best solution found by branch and price and Cplex. And for the 1-to-1 instances, we see that our heuristic does on average 14% worse. And so we're able to find fast and effective solutions. We also see that our branch and price framework is outperforming Cplex in terms of our solution quality and time to solution. And we're able to obtain tighter upper bounds as well, which is really evident in the number of branch and bound nodes that are explored. Again, Cplex is exploring 10 to the 6. So this is orders of magnitude more branch and bound nodes than ours, right? We're able to solve on the root node here for the small instance, and Cplex needs 800,000, right? If I increase the size of the instances, we do see some degradation in methodology efficiency. Our heuristic is now 30% worse, but again, we can still see that our branch and price framework is still outperforming Cplex in the same reasons. But to give Cplex its fair shot here, when you look through the actual results, Cplex is able to find better lower bounds for most of those medium-sized instances compared to our branch and price framework. So what did we do? Well, again, we're trying to find quantitative support to decision makers for target surveillance. We come up with a mixed integer program to model this under a deterministic setting. We formulate a branch and price framework to go ahead and solve this exactly, that leverages some of those combinatorial structures that we see in the problem. We formulate a 2-stage heuristic as well to find effective initial solutions, and we can make the confirmation that our algorithm outperforms Cplex. Lastly, where are we going? Well, I deal with a deterministic setting. You really want target surveillance plans to be adaptable. And so what we're in the process of submitting a paper on adaptable route plans where you have sudden materialization of targets or time-sensitive targets that come to be. And so you can model a Markov decision process for this where you're going to make changes depending upon how that system is updating at each decision epoch. Another thing we see is that, well, the amount of coverage I get is really dependent upon where those GPS markers are located. And so waypoint generation is really key to the efficacy of these solution methodologies. And so we're looking at two-stage stochastic programming models for those waypoint generation techniques. And we aim to submit this for the middle part of this year. And with that, I will conclude.
Josh, thank you very much. We had one, well, it was my question. I'll come to it offline or at the end if there's time remaining.
Sure.
But thank you very much for sharing your work. We're looking forward to seeing it in print, and we're looking to see where you land on the far side of your job search. I know it'll be someplace great.
Thanks so much.
Our second half of our presentation today, with gratitude towards both speakers for sharing the session, is our recipient in 2020 of the J. Steinhardt Prize. This is sponsored by the Center for Naval Analyses, and the recipient in 2020, I'm sorry, I'm keep my video here. The recipient in 2020 is Dr. Gregory Parnell, professor of practice at the University of Arkansas. I could spend 10 minutes reading you his biography, but the short version is Dr. Parnell has about 3 lifetimes worth of contributions in, well, he's not done with his lifetime. He's got much more to go and many more contributions to go. He's taught at West Point, the Air Force Institute of Technology, where he was the department head, Virginia Commonwealth University, currently at Arkansas, and has been an advisor, researcher, mentor, and scholar throughout. So what we've asked him to do is just share some of his insights from a career plus worth of contributions. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Greg to share what he'd like to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, sir. We see the slides, and you'll just, if you'll go to,
Okay,
I think you'll need to, in the display settings, switch screens. So display settings is in the upper left there, and you'll just want to swap.
I'm not sure I know how to do that.
Oh, my apologies. So if you go to full screen with the slides.
Okay, full screen, got it. Okay.
Oops, let's see. Yep, there you go. And now if you look in the upper left, so we're seeing the presenter view right now. So you'll want to go in the upper left, you'll see a drop down that says display settings.
Okay, I do not see that.
Oh, right, you almost hovered over, it says, let's see, trying to zoom in. On the presenter view, so whatever screen you see your presenter view.
Okay, maybe, yeah, maybe it would be easier if you shared yours. I don't know.
Sure, I can absolutely do that.
Okay.
And
that'll be a Control L to go into display mode.
there we go.
PDF.
And can everyone see, I can see it. Okay. All right. Oops, my apologies. How about that slide deck? Sorry about that.
Right.
There we go.
Okay, all set?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, great. So first of all, thank you very much for both from CNA, from Informs Mass, from the committee, and then finally from my department for nominating me. Next chart. Okay, I advocate you giving a bottom line up front. So first I'm going to describe my past, and as my wife says, I'm overeducated and can't hold a job, so I'll try to prove that to you. And then I'm going to give you a brief review of the various military and security clients I've worked with. And then I want to try to illustrate 10 really fundamentally important lessons learned that I've had along this journey. So next chart. Okay. So I'm going to start with a career summary and then some lessons learned, most of which were the hard way. So this just shows you that I'm overeducated, had the opportunity to go to some great schools, next chart, and had difficulty holding a job. So I was in the Air Force for 25 years, did space, R&D, had a 4-year Pentagon assignment with a variety of jobs, and then concluded my career as department head at AFIT, and then subsequently went to Virginia Commonwealth, and then West Point, did a year as a visiting professor at the Air Force Academy, and then finally have been at the University of Arkansas for about 7 years, a little over 7 years. And during the time after I got out of the Air Force, I worked for a series of consulting companies, began with Toffler. Most of the time was devoted to innovative decisions, which is now part of ITA International. Next chart. So I've also, along the way, done a very large number of professional short courses, usually done based on my books, the 3 books that I've edited or written, co-written. And so I've done about 75 of those. They're usually a week, sometimes a few days, been for industry as well as government organizations. And they've focused in the areas that are listed here on the chart, and they've all involved projects. So I've got to have a wide experience of how people can apply decision analysis and decision making. Next chart. Okay, professional service. So I've also been very active in professional service, Informs, including Decision Analysis Society, and of course MASS, and then INCOSI, MORS, and a variety of others. And then spent quite a bit of time as a panel member for the National Security Agency for their advisory board. And then I've had the opportunity to work on 5 national science and engineering and National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Most of mine have been engineering and science. And I just finished chairing one. That report is in the final coordination now. Next chart. During my time at the Pentagon, those 4 years were very formative for me in terms of experience. One of my early mentors was Lieutenant General Glenn Kent, and then I worked for a variety of senior officers and had the opportunity to present to several chiefs of staff, but mostly General Welch, and then I had the opportunity to present to the Secretary of the Air Force on several occasions. What I learned in that is when it comes to the Pentagon and perhaps other analysis, we have 3 opportunities to contribute. We can educate in advance, we can support in real time, and we can analyze the fallout. So I always strove to educate, get ahead of the curve, educate in advance, support in real time. Sometimes that meant long nights and weekends in many cases, and then tried to avoid the analyzing the fallout. Next chart. So I worked for as a consultant, and also was having research sponsored my university roles for a wide variety of organizations. They're shown on the left. And I'm just showing the military and security clients. I also have worked in other areas. And then just on the right is just the variety of different activities: capability-based planning, analysis of alternatives, base realignment and closure, and then all the way down to my more current activities, which are funded for the last several years from ERDIC, the Army's Engineer Research and Development Center. Next chart. So now I'd like to go through the 10 lessons learned, try to hit them very succinctly, but also give you some pictures and graphs that illustrate the lesson. So the first one is everything always starts with people. So Number one lesson is work with great people. And so, and I've been extremely fortunate, and a couple of those folks are on the here listening to this presentation, which is wonderful. So in my view, a great project is one that's an important opportunity. It's got a client and sponsor that's great. I mean, they want to do the right thing. They want to make a change. They are supportive of and understanding of what you're doing and give you great advice. And then finally, a great team has people, including, it's very important to add diverse team to capture all the perspectives and elements. And so the people I've worked with, I've been blessed with working with great consulting companies, and I've had great clients, and then my colleagues at the various universities I've worked with have always joined and worked with several of those at each school. And then finally, I've had a wonderful opportunity to meet a lot of colleagues across the nation and across the world, and through professional service, including being on the National Academy of Science, Engineering, Medicine committees, where we meet a great group of people. Number two. So number two, it always starts with defining the problem, or a better term would be opportunity. So in our systems decision-making book, if I were to do the third edition, I would change problem definition to opportunity definition. I always tell students and colleagues that the initial problem is never the full problem. And I've never been wrong on that so far. It's always changes. And so the other thing is very important about a problem and opportunity is don't be a hammer looking for nails. So I tend to work on decision and risk analysis projects. If I look at it and I decide that it's maybe more appropriate for another technique or methodology that I'm not an expert in, I recommend the client go to another one. So we are going to try to work on problems where my tool set and interests align. Next chart, number three. So this is a very important one, is focus on value first. When I was in the Pentagon, the approach typically was it was alternative focus. Somebody would come up with a force structure or an idea, and they'd always have three solutions. One was wonderful but unaffordable. One was the solution the person was advocating, and one was just terrible, right? And so the expectation was that you would come and support the one that they were advocating. So that's what we call alternative focus thinking. What I advocate, and many of my colleagues, including Ralph Keeney with his book, Value Focused Thinking, is always start with our values first. What are we trying to achieve? And we want to develop better alternatives and then use the values. Next chart. So the fundamental ideas are four ideas. Is first, work to create decision opportunities using our energy and creativity. Start with our values, then generate better alternatives. If the best we have are crummy alternatives, the best known models and simulation to mankind will only come up with a crummy alternative. So we want to work to strive to get better alternatives. And then finally, we can use our values to evaluate alternatives. So opportunity is always broader than problem definition, and it's important that we provide more value if we create or improve solutions. Number four, or a continuation of three. So there's a lot of benefits of value-focused thinking. These are well documented in Keeney's book, and I added one more to it, which is improved solution implementation. So I found that if you got the values of the people who are responsible for implementing the solution, and you consider them in your whole process, then you have a much better chance of being successful with the decision by having it implemented. On to number four. Okay, number four is one that I've worked on extensively the last several years, and realization of the need to build integrated models for very complex problems. And when I mean an integrated model, I'm talking about a decision. When we make the decision, we simultaneously propagate through all the other models, all the way through to the value and to the cost model. So we can display these. And so we can't take this, we can't do cost in a separate model, performance in a separate model, value in a separate model, where there's no guarantee that we're really adequately exploring the trade space. The other aspect that's very important in this age of analytics here is to realize that in military OR and security, we've been doing analytics for a long time. We have descriptive analytics, like what is the past, and then we have predictive analytics. What would happen in the future if we change designs? And then prescriptive is what do we want? Next chart. So another subtlety that is not well understood is that we really should be looking at, when we talk about integrated models, we don't treat the ilities separately. They should be integrated in with every performance measure. So availability, reliability, survivability, restorability, all those can be seen in what we call a mission chain. So I say the following: the ilities are too important to treat separately. They should be integrated in, and then it's only then that we really see the true impact that they have on the decision. So they need to be integrated into all our performance measures and our cost model. So for example, if you have a cost model that doesn't change as you change reliability of the system, there's probably something radically wrong with your cost model, right? So it should have a dramatic impact, or at least significant impact. Next chart. Okay, the fifth one is, it's a lesson that I learned early on in the Pentagon, that a simple model delivered on time was better than a complex model that was late, and I'll talk about that again. And so that's very important. And the way you get simple models is you get them better is by what we now call agile development, right? We get a model that works, and then we continue to develop it. So in this particular example, we started out with a discrete study out of the book Trade-off Analytics, and then we tried with the idea of building an integrated model, and then we wanted to incorporate set-based design. And it took us, using agile development, about 12 iterations before we got to the final version. And we found that expert and client feedback was critical in that whole process. So the problem with developing models is decision makers and stakeholders don't know what they want until they see it. And once they see what you can do, they can tell you better what they need. And the other thing we many times forget is the fact that their knowledge of the problem and the opportunity is increasing while you're doing your work, right? It isn't like you got a brain dump from them a month ago and nothing changes. Their knowledge changes. So Agile is a great way to develop decision tools. Next chart. A very important thing, capability, once you have integrated models, is you need to explore the decision space. So in this particular study, we did a case study with a UAV, and we used what the concept called set-based design, which we've published several papers on and be happy to provide to folks. And we began it with a very large number, the red dots, of what the experts thought were very good solutions. And when we bin these into sets, and the set drivers in this case were engine, type, and wingspan, we found that in fact, what the point solutions were significantly away from the Pareto frontier. And that was a very useful lesson. Now, mathematically, we should have figured this out, because the probability of having any finite number of alternatives be the optimal one in an infinite trade space is approximately 0, right? But this one illustrated it pretty graphically. And I think it was shocking to the developers of the alternatives, who really thought they had developed great alternatives. But what it shows too is that these systems are so complex and the interactions are so complex and nonlinear that it is not obvious how to do that. Next chart. A really surprising development of this work, we wanted to validate, and our client wanted us to validate, that we were really finding the efficient frontier using set-based design with Monte Carlo simulation, sampling from the design space. And so we ran these points here. We ran optimization models, nonlinear optimization, genetic, to find we varied the cost and then try to find the highest value one. And surprisingly, we found that the trade space exploration that we had done found 189 designs that dominated the 26 genetic algorithm points, which are the black points on this chart. So that really motivated us to become believers in using set-based design to explore the trade space. Next. Okay, this one is very important, is to always consider uncertainty. I'm astounded in the logic of we could do a deterministic model of a future system that was going to operate for 20 years or 40 years, right? Without considering uncertainty. So one of my favorite book is Sam Savage's book on this, and where he has this wonderful picture here about a statistician that drowns trying to cross a creek that's about 3 feet deep. Right? And everybody I know likes this except for my friends that are statisticians. So I've become a big fan of probability management. Before that, I used at-risk. Probability management has some interesting advantages. And we know that we can convert any spreadsheet model to a Monte Carlo simulation. And then what we can see is that the downside risk is almost always greater than the upside opportunity. Now, that might be counterintuitive for some of you, but I think the simplest example is consider an industrial engineering example where you build a capacity. And you have to pick a capacity. Well, what happens? When you simulate the demand and the production and everything, you find that when the demand is low, you get all the downside risk of low demand. And but when the demand is high, your capacity limited and you don't get the upside. So as a result, I believe this is the case in many models, that the downside risk. So it's always important to consider uncertainty. Next chart. Along the line of that is sometimes the uncertainty when we look at years in advance. In this case, this study was done in 1995, and we did a study for 2025, which is getting pretty close now. And in that study, we looked at different alternative futures of what how technology would develop, how world power would be concentrated, and what the American view would be, global or domestic. And then we evaluated a very large number of alternatives, and we changed our models, value model, by setting our weights and values to what we would be if we knew we were in that alternative state. And that gave us a range of values, and it showed us the ones that were really valuable overall and the ones that their value depended significantly on the state that it was in. Next chart. So the next one is the point is about understanding the value of information. So when we build this mission chain in using probability management, we were able to look at what would happen if we had no perfect options. That's the upper left-hand corner. If we increase availability, reliability, survivability, restorability, or detection. And what we see is that that increasing survivability had the biggest impact and detection second impact. So having more information and improving our survivability would have had the biggest impact. Now, that's probably not true for all studies, but this technique can be applied to look at where you want to spend your next dollar. Next chart. So this is important, being able to communicate clearly and concisely. So communication is a critical soft skill, and we all need to be better communicators. And one of the most important professional skills is how to be able to communicate. Decision makers do not have the time or patience for detail. They want to know what's the bottom line and what's the written message on each chart. So the bottom line up front, if you've never used it, is a tool to help the decision maker understand at the beginning what you're going to conclude and perhaps why you're going to conclude it. And then they can guide, they're not guessing what you're going to end up with, right? They can guide their questions to make the most use for them. And then the other is to the discipline of putting a written message on each chart. So if you can't write a bumper sticker or a written message for each chart, it probably doesn't belong in your presentation. So it's a great way of putting together what the major message was. And then next chart. Finally is number 10, tell a story. So what I'd like to do is illustrate this story by a story that I've told many times, and it's in our book, Handbook of Decision Analysis. And the story goes like this. Once upon a time, like all great stories start with once upon a time, a young man inherited the family home, and the family home was in a remote area. It was by a lovely creek, and it was a very nice home, vacation home, had been in his family. But over time, the grandparents had passed away and people had moved away, and the house had fallen in disrepair. And our hero inherited this house. Well, he inherited the house. It was in rundown condition. The windows were boarded up, and he couldn't even figure out how to get in the house the first time he went to it. And he happened to move back to the area, and so he'd been away and he came back. And so he was going to live in the area, and his goal was to kind of improve the house and bring it up to speed. Well, he went around several times. Finally, he couldn't get in the house. Finally, he found a coal chute. So our hero went down the coal chute to get into the house. And of course, he ended up covered with dirt, soot, and grime from the coal chute. The coal chutes were, for you younger folks, were what was used, but trucks would come up with coal, and then furnaces would be in the basement. So our hero got in the house, and then for a period of a year, he spent many nights, several weekends, and all of his vacation time fixing up this house. And he had to, take off the boarded up shutters. He had to replace them. He had to clean out the house completely, put new furniture. And he worked for a year of overtime compared to his regular job and weekends and his vacation time. And finally came his opportunity to show all his friends. But the final thing he did was he installed silver door handles and a double door entry that opened up into a spiral staircase with a beautiful chandelier. So he now completed this, and he decided to have a party. So he invited all of his friends to the house to show them what he'd done. So how did he bring them in the house? Well, the answer is he brought them through the coal chute. Well, why did he do that? Well, he brought them through the coal chute because he wanted them to understand how hard he'd worked, how difficult it was, and how complex and how diligent he was, how smart he was, how capable he was, right? So he wanted to tell them every detail. Now, what did his friends and family want? Well, his friends and family, they wanted to go through the front door. They wanted to see the chandelier. Next chart. So they wanted to see the view. They didn't want to go down the coal chute. So the analogy is for us as military and security analysts is we're the hero of the story, right? We want to tell people how diligent we are, but our clients and sponsors, they don't want to go through the coal chute. They just want to know, tell me what the bottom line is, tell me how you got there, tell me what I need to do, right? So the other thing, the reason I conclude with this story is the following, is that stories, every one of your presentation should be a story, because you got to tell them what the story is of what you learned, because people remember stories, and it's a great way to remember. So if you can tell your work as a story, they're much more likely to remember it. Next chart. So I want to just conclude summary. There's the top 10 things that I learned, mostly the hard way, and I'd be happy to answer anybody's questions at this time.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dr. Parnell. That absolutely was wonderful. Let's see here.
I do not see any questions at this time. I appreciate, and we appreciate both you, Josh Margolis, and you, Greg Parnell, for sharing your developing research thread, Josh, and your some of your insights as well, Greg. To everyone who attended today, we appreciate your time. We're going to have our next webinar in March. Look for that announcement. Today, we had this wonderful opportunity to recognize and hear from 2 of the annual award recipients. Please think about nominating folks for these awards in the upcoming year. As mentioned, the Bonder Scholarship is for a promising doctoral student or candidate, and they're developing research thread. The Steinhardt Award for Dr. Parnell is for a lifetime of contributions. And one that we had a webinar in December on is the Koopman Award, the best published paper in military and security in the previous year. So something with a 2020 publication date. All of those nominations will be coming due at the end of June with more information to follow. Sean, did I miss anything?
Just like to encourage everyone, please, if you have more questions about the society, we encourage you reach out to us. Our email addresses are on the screen. We really do want to connect with you and hear from you. Encourage you to reach out to us on these handles as well. And just again, congratulations on the well-deserved awards, and thank you both gentlemen for your wonderful contributions to the community.
Hey, thanks.
Josh, I'll follow up with you. There are a couple questions that were posted on Q&A, and I'll pass those to you so you have them, and sure, you can answer offline in the interest of everyone's collective time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. And again, the presentation will be recorded and posted on YouTube shortly, so watch out for that announcement as well. Now, thank you again.
If I may, just, Sean, are we at a hard stop?
We are not, no. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and we can continue as the speakers. I'm not, my apologies, not sure if the speakers have hard stops, but we are not at a hard stop for the webinar time. So, but I will stop the recording.
Thank you. Greg, there was one from Liam Boir. If I mispronounced that, I apologize, Liam.